Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea Tour is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, David Hayes, and Polar Inertia Journal, an outlet for artists and researchers documenting the urban condition at polarinertia.com. When you first came to Korea and started making a life for yourself, what subway stations did that life revolve around?
I guess when I first moved to Seoul, my very first time here, that would have been Seongjong Station, which is like way over on the west side of town, kind of near Gimpo Airport. Not a whole lot there, very residential. When I moved back to Korea, my job was up in Nohwanggu, like up in the very kind of northeast corner of town. And so that would have been Sangye Station, which was the closest. It revolved around a lot of places where I went out to, like Hongdae, to places downtown, like Anjongno. I guess those are the main ones.
This is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, speaking to you from not too far from the Anam station here in Seoul, Korea, speaking with Charlie Usher, who writes a blog called Seoul Suburban, urban, which is about the exploration of Seoul through its subway stations. Whether you live here or not, it's very useful, and I certainly used it as a way to get my head into Seoul, especially into the way the transit system works before I came here. The blog has also recently become a book here in Korea called, let me get this right, Chariwa Rijue Jiachol Yohengi, Charlie and Liz's subway travelogue. Who's Liz?
Liz is my friend Liz Gresham. She's a photographer, and when I started the project, I started it with her. I did the writing, she did the photography, and so we worked on it together for about 3 years, so 2012, and at that point, she left Korea, but the bulk of the photography on the website is hers, and all the photography that's in the book is hers as well.
When did you begin to get a sense that Seoul was best explored for you through not just its subway lines, but not just the places they go, but its actual stations themselves, using those as a framework?
Pretty much the first day that I got to Seoul, because
look at that map, you're like, damn.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the map, and it's even bigger now than it was the first time I came here because I've added a lot more. But the station. The system is just so extensive, and particularly for like expats who've arrived in the country and in the city, it's really sort of the way that you kind of organize your concept of Seoul's layout. Because it's really hard to sort of like commit to memory all the names of the different neighborhoods, but you know what your local subway station is, and typically when you move here without a car, so you're reliant on public transportation, and 9 times out of 10 that's going to be the subway system. So you conceive of where you are and where you're going based on the station, and for a long time Seoul didn't have. They had a pretty nonsensical address system.
Yes. Based on the construction date of the buildings, right?
Right, yeah. They finally started to fix that. But you still have like the delivery guys, the pizza delivery and Chinese food delivery, they still want to use the old address. But you can like just give someone an address and they'd know where it is. So even businesses, like on their business cards, on their flyers, would have directions from the nearest subway station. So, not just as a foreigner here, but for Koreans too. I think a lot of people they know where stations are, and that they're sort of kind of really closely integrated into people's concept of the city's layout.
Right. It's one thing that struck me especially about Seoul's subway system, because there's many good things you can say about it. It's certainly one of the better overall systems I've encountered in the world. even by Asian standards. But, for example, to take the subway system in where I live, Los Angeles, it's more extensive, of course, than Los Angeles, as it's got, 500 stations versus less than 100 in Los Angeles. But it's not just that it's vastly more extensive, it's that it's more integrated into the city itself. You never really know. It's not like you go underground and you're in a completely different place. You're not in Seoul anymore. You're still in Seoul. You can still shop in all the subway stations.
Yeah.
The people are above ground, the people are underground. It's all of a piece, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one aspect of that is, like you mentioned, just the fact that city life doesn't stop at the subway entrance. You go down, you go underneath. In most places, you have like a convenience store down there. You've got maybe some clothing or cosmetic shops.
If you had to live for like a year with only buying from subway station shops, you could do it, right?
You could quite easily do it. There are some stations where like you could live for a year within that station,
and they're cheaper too. Which is kind of nice.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's one big aspect. I think another aspect is just that Seoul is such a densely populated city, like much more so than a place like LA, that it's very rare to find like a station empty. Yeah. So you constantly have people coming in and out of like almost any station, and so the kind of like the daily life that happens on the street outside the station really sort of seeps into the underground, because you constantly have people coming and going. You have people who use you have elderly folks who use the rest areas to kind of hang out. You've got like young Korean kids, who practice b-boying in their, in kind of like empty hallways. So it's not, when you enter the subway, you don't feel like you've left the city at all. Yeah.
What were some of your methods for first documenting your travels through the subway here? Was it systematic? Were you thinking about stations you used all the time, or thinking about far-flung ones at the beginning?
We just started, and we still mostly do it kind of at random, because like the project kind of came about through a sense of guilt a little bit. And that was like the first time that I lived here, I was kind of constantly going to the same, half dozen or dozen subway stations. So
as you would in any city where you live, you know a handful of places, and you wear that path thin by using it over and over again. But there's so much, especially in a city like Seoul.
Yeah, you need
a system.
Yeah, you have your routines and you have your routes. And so when I came back, I wanted to explore this broader city a lot more. So when we started, we picked like a random station and went there and just saw what was there, really without much preparation. And
in the station and the neighborhood or immediately around it, I mean, how far do you go away from the stations usually when you're writing about one?
Generally, you would kind of go to like whatever is the halfway point between that station and the next one.
Because they're never that far away.
Most of the time they're not, yeah. Like you get to some areas, especially kind of on the edges of the city, or, like where you have mountains nearby. And like in those places, we just kind of go within like a reasonable distance. You'll walk a mile or two, but not more than that. Yeah. Like we went to, not too long ago, we did Gyeongbokgung, which, by the main palace. And really like as you go north of there, like there's a ton of interesting neighborhoods, but there's no like near station. So we went a fair ways north, but we could have kept going for like 5 miles, but for our sanity's sake, we didn't do that.
Yes. What are some of your favorite, we talk about the stations, we talk about the neighborhoods, what are some of your favorite stations themselves, just within the stations? What stations are some of the coolest places themselves to you in Seoul?
I mean, a lot of the stations are pretty anonymous. Architecturally, the Noksapyeong station is kind of cool. It has just a very different layout. Has sort of this kind of big, like cylindrical kind of shaft in the middle. that the escalators are built around. Some stations, like if you go to Gangnam Station, it's the station itself is almost like it's less station and almost kind of more shopping mall.
Right. Yes, which is very impressive, especially. I mean, we're both from America, where public transportation culture it's rooted in certain cities. It's rooted in certain major cities, and some it's taking hold now. Like it seems pretty late, and some it hasn't taken root at all. But really, the shopping in the stations is always striking to us, right?
Yeah. It's the first time I saw that. Yeah, it really made an impression. Now it's very. Well, yeah, of course.
Yeah, why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah, if you want to buy, a raincoat or a new hat, of course you get it in the subway station. But Gangnam is, even by Seoul subway standards, the Gangnam station is just packed with little boutiques where you can get everything from underwear to cell phones to purses, and they've got a bunch of small restaurants there too.
Do any of these stations have like capsule hotels? I feel like that's a market to be explored.
Yeah, it could be. No, they don't. Although you're rarely far from like just a small hotel or inn or jjimjilbang.
Sure, right outside. You can sleep in the jjimjilbang. That's very true.
Check up there for the night.
Now you mentioned going places far from, say, Gangnam, out to the outskirts where the subway lines end for the moment anyway. Tell me, it's the blog is called Seoul Sub. Arrow. Do you just say Seoul Suburban? Do you pronounce the arrow in any way?
No, I just say suburban, yeah.
But it's funny because I feel like in this city, there's definitely an urban-suburban distinction somewhere, but a foreigner can't easily distinguish between what is urban Seoul, what is suburban Seoul. What have you learned about how that happens? How one part sort of, do they like fade into the other, or is it starker than I would think by just being here a week?
Yeah. I don't think there is the same sort of like urban-suburban divide that we have in the States. Like, I've had students of mine, like I teach English, and I've had students of mine try to ask me to explain like what are the suburbs, and I try to come up with a parallel in Seoul and Korea, and it's I can't really, because it's a different sort of dynamic. Like you don't have like truly like suburban areas in the way that we think of them in the U.S. You have neighborhoods that are just much more residential.
Right. But they still have plenty of businesses.
They still have a lot of businesses, and they're still typically quite compact. Right. It's just it's less commercial, and it's on the edge, but it's not. It's not the way that we think of suburban areas, sort of like spread out.
The American style.
Yeah.
We also, to turn it around, in America, we don't have a Seoul. We don't have a city that's New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and probably a couple of others put together. How did you come to understand the role Seoul plays in Korea, given that nothing is the equivalent in America?
Yeah. In the U.S., it isn't. You have similar kind of cities in other countries, though.
London, say.
Yeah, London. London is a good example where there are a lot of countries where you have like one city that is really the focal point of everything that happens in the country, like politically, economically, culturally, and so there's like sort of that city and then everything else. And Seoul is definitely like that. So, living here, you can sometimes, it's easy to forget that there's a whole rest of the country.
Other cities with subway systems of their own. I was riding on Busan's the other day, and it felt really different after riding Seoul's for a while. Like, hey, this looks and feels not strange, but it's definitely not Seoul. Have you rode around on the other subway systems in Korea?
Just Busan's, and Busan's is a little different. It's the trains themselves are a little more narrow, and I think Busan people tend to be just a little more outgoing too. So a lot of times you have strangers who kind of strike up a conversation across the aisle,
which, as I understand it, does not happen in Seoul.
No. Everyone's too engrossed on their smartphones for that to happen.
Of course, in Busan they speak Busan Satori, so if they talk to me, I would have a kind of a hard time understanding them, given that Seoul people even I don't sometimes understand. But In writing this blog, tell me, what was the point you realized you had sort of a viable way to really explore new places in Seoul? Like, you realized it was taking you places you really wouldn't have gone.
Yeah. I'd say like after the first couple months, because before we started, one of the worries, kind of one of the preconceived notions a lot of people have about Seoul is that it's a very monotone city, that it's very repetitive. Like you have big apartment towers, and that are just replicated like chunk, 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 chunk.
It can look like that from a distance.
Yeah, from a distance it can. And so we were worried that, we'd start this project and then after a few months or a few weeks, we'd kind of feel like we're just going to the same neighborhood over and over and over. And we'd lose interest and it wouldn't be a project that was of interest to anybody else. But, once you get away from that sort of macro perspective, looking at it from a distance where it's all just repetitive apartment towers, and you start looking at it on a much more like micro level, like you find out that the city isn't like that at all, and it might not be like as diverse as somewhere like New York or London, but it does have a lot of diversity and a lot of nuance within its neighborhood. So
the closer you look, the richer it is.
Yeah, and so like after we started looking, a month or two, we kind of figured out that this was something that was going to work.
Now, I was showing Seoul Suburban to some of the Korean friends that I have in Los Angeles. I mean, there's a lot of Korean people in Los Angeles, and so I can speak.
Biggest population outside of Korea?
Seoul, I think, yeah. Well, I mean, outside of Seoul and other big cities, there's not 5 million Koreans in Los Angeles. So there are in Busan, but that's in a non-Korean city. It's the biggest Korean population. But I was showing it to Korean friends there, and they were saying, "Wow, they were like really impressed that somebody would do this." Because one friend, she was saying, "Yeah, this is just the system I used to get around. I never think about it." And when did you realize that Seoul Suburban was also of interest to Korean people?
Not immediately, because I do, obviously all the writing on the blog is in English, and I tend, like, when I write it, I don't write it thinking that Koreans might be reading. Like I write it.
You don't hear it to them.
No, yeah, like I write it at the level, like as if I'm writing for an English audience, and so I didn't know if we'd have much of a Korean audience, and I'm still not exactly sure what percentage of our visitors are Korean, but we do get some, and
it ginned up enough interest for a Korean language book.
Yeah,
that's something.
Yeah. And we did occasionally get like comments or emails from Korean readers, kind of often sort of like expressing surprise at something that they didn't know was there.
Yeah, it's fresh eyes, right?
Yeah, it's fresh eyes. It's a different perspective, and I think more than anything, it's just beyond just being like fresh eyes. It's a set of eyes that kind of made. It's a conscious set of eyes. It's a set, like you have to kind of like make the decision to look. Yeah. So you have to make the decision to see what's there, and that which is something that we've done with the blog. And if you don't make that decision, it's you miss a lot of the detail. It just sort of blends together, and that's certainly not something that's limited to Seoul, but that's true of anywhere.
I suppose if you turn it around and if there was some Korean person doing a blog, it was their guide to Wisconsin, where you're from, you'd read that, right?
Totally. I would love to see that. I'd love to get their perspective. I think it would be, especially because there's not a significant Korean population
right,
in Wisconsin. We've got, there's a fair number at like the university in Madison, but outside of that milieu, you don't have too many. So I'd love to see that.
What has living in Seoul, living in Korea, focusing your attentions here for so long, made you realize about America, about Wisconsin, about wherever you consider yourself as being from? Do you get a new perspective yourself? Even if there's no Korean writing about this, has it given you a perspective on the homeland from being here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think anytime you live somewhere else, you're able to pick up a new perspective about your original. The original place that you lived, and Yeah, I mean, there's, it's weird because, like, you get, I mean, at least I have gotten, in some ways you get a lot closer to, like, your origins, and you identify with them a lot more. And, like, for me, that's kind of I've become a lot more appreciative of just, like, the level of diversity that the U.S. has in the U.S. is even coming from, like, a place like Wisconsin, which is a very, like, white place. It's not particularly diverse, but I miss having much more diverse groups of ethnicities and religions.
Population level diversity.
Korea is a much more, like, community-based society. So this sort of the sense of like, it sounds a little cliche to say, but, like, the U.S. sense of, like, individualism.
Which translates to what in your mind? What does that individualism afford you?
There's a relative, like, lack of sort of expectation or pressure for people to do something a certain way or to be a certain way, and which there's a lot more of that in Korea. There's
for Koreans, but you're sort of free with that, right?
For me, I'm outside of that. I'm as an expat, you get to be kind of you're the asterisk. That's the exception.
Yeah, we don't count here.
So I do appreciate that sense of individualism that I think is much more prevalent in the U.S. But on the flip side, you also you come to I've come to kind of understand and appreciate a little bit more, like, the deep sense of community that Korea has here. And so now I kind of often find things, like, in the U.S. sometimes in certain ways, like, too individualistic, especially when it comes to, like, notions of politics. Individual liberty is great, but it's not a way to have a society function.
Right. Well, the problem, too, is that individual liberty, the phrase itself, you can interpret any way you like. And if you're a politician, you just use that phrase to mean whatever happens to be your platform.
Yeah. And then, of course, like, just through this project, I really lament the poor state of public transportation in the U.S.
Yeah. What do you make of that? Why is it? Why are we so far behind when we used to be so far ahead in terms of everything else?
I don't have we ever been, like, that far ahead with public transportation?
I mean, in terms of everything else. That's why I add that. Yeah. That's, we were the most advanced country in the world in 1960, and now there's really not that much claim to that anymore. Especially in transit terms, especially. But why do you think we never really got up on the horse, so to speak, with transit?
I think a lot of it has to do just with how the country developed. I mean, you have to look at how it was settled from, like, east to west. And, like, in the east, you have very dense cities where public transportation is viable, but as people moved west, the tendency was you had all this land. Sure. And you had a tendency just to spread out. And when you built cities, the tendency was to spread those out. And once you do that, you build a city first, then you build a transportation system. And when you have a really spread out city, building a good public transportation system is much more difficult.
Right. It's more about density than anything.
Yeah. I mean, Seoul is, like, one of the most densely populated cities in the world. So, you can build a public transportation system and know that it's going to get a lot of use and that it's going to be something good. Whereas in the U.S., there's a lot of cities where it's just building a subway is just not particularly feasible, and, like, even maintaining a good like bus system can be a challenge.
Right.
And there's also this kind of a stigma in the U.S. too that public transportation is for poor people and weirdos.
There is that.
And how much of that is cause, how much of that is effect of the poor state of public transportation, I'm not sure. But in Seoul, it's there's definitely not that stigma. Everybody uses it, so there's a willingness to put money into the system to maintain it, to make investments, to expand it, to make it better, that you don't see in too many places in the U.S.
Right, I think about it comes up in a lot of the conversations I record back in Los Angeles about the transit there, and it does get looked to, at least in North America, as a city that really is moving forward with transit building. And at times I can admire a lot of what they do there because I use it all the time myself. But then I come to a place like Seoul and realize, oh, this is what a subway system looks like. It has 500 stations, not 100. It doesn't. There's not many places that you just can't go period on it here. But I wonder, given all the exploration you do on the subway system, do you ever just start longing to see what lies far beyond where the trains go?
Yeah, but there aren't that many places far beyond where the trains go.
I can't imagine. Where don't they go? Why would a train not go somewhere here?
I think the main reason is the mountains. Pretty much the only places that the trains don't go are the real mountainous areas, particularly.
You can't go up into them.
Yeah, particularly north of like Gyeongbokgung, north of the area where you have like Bukhan Mountain. But for the most part, just about everywhere you can build a station, you can expand the system. They have, and I think like in some places too. I think there are plans to kind of add like a light rail line to places where it's harder to build the subway.
You can have some confidence that if there's not a way to get there fast, there probably will be at some point.
But I mean, even if the subway doesn't get there, they have buses that run there, and we talked a lot about the subway, and the blog and the book is focused on the subway, but the bus system too here. Like once you can figure it out, because the bus system is a little daunting.
Often only in Korea.
Yeah, but once you can figure it out, the bus system too is really good, and it's really closely integrated with the subway system.
I was looking at the bookstore over at eBay, Women's University, and I was looking at the travel books, and they had a book just about Seoul by bus, and the thrust was I was reading through it, and it was for Koreans. It was only in Korean. It's like, hey, you can also ride the bus in Seoul. Here are all the places you can go on the bus. It was kind of the bus equivalent of Seoul Suburban. I mean, you do see a completely different city based on which transit system you use, don't you? Whether you're walking, whether you're riding the bus, whether you're on the subway system. I mean, whether you're on taxis, how many different sort of layers of Seoul are there with transit like this?
Yeah, it's quite fun. Yeah, and I guess that's kind of the one knock on the subway system is that it's it's a little wormholey. Like you pop in one end and you pop out the other, and you don't have a whole lot of sense of what's in between. And fortunately for me, just from doing this project for so long and going to so many different subway stations, I kind of have been able to get a sense of like how the city's stitched together, what's in between. But taking the bus or taking the taxi, you get to kind of see all the places in between subway stations, and you are able to get to neighborhoods that you can't just access from the train, which are quite often some of like the nicest neighborhoods in the city because they aren't close to a subway station. There hasn't been as much pressure to develop them, so often
seclusion relatively.
Yeah, often they're older. Often you had the air is a little bit nicer because you're kind of on mountain slopes. They're less busy. They're less frantic. So it is kind of important to not just use the subway, but to also take advantage of things like buses and to get to other areas.
Now, when and why did you first come to Korea?
I first came to Korea in 2005, and I came because I just graduated and I wanted to live overseas for a bit somewhere. I didn't plan on it turning into being quite this long.
No one seems to.
Yeah. And Korea, there's no good reason I came here, to be honest.
In a way, the best reason is that.
I was initially looking at going to Europe or going to Japan, but then I found out that my University of Wisconsin, where I graduated from, had the previous year had started this kind of teacher exchange program with Gyeonggi Province, just outside of Seoul. And so they would send over like 40 or 50 recent grads to teach English in public schools, and they'd bring over Korean teachers to take education or English classes. And
so would they be teaching Korean in Wisconsin at all? Was it possible to learn Korean in Wisconsin because of that?
Yeah,
would they be teaching?
I don't know if those people were teaching Korean, but I mean they had a Korean
classes.
They had a Korean program. Yeah,
Did you do anything in that?
No, I had like zero interest or zero knowledge of the country before I signed up for the program.
And I just knew it was in Asia somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, like I knew it was in Asia. I knew its location. My aunts and uncle had come to the Olympics here in '88, so I knew about that. And
did they have stories of what Seoul was like in '88, and how did they contrast starkly to Seoul today?
Yeah, very different city.
Have they visited you here?
No, they haven't. I've invited them, so hopefully they'll come. But yeah, it's a starkly different city. A lot more polluted, for one thing. A lot less tourists, foreigner friendly. Now, pretty much every sign is going to be in Korean and English, and that just wasn't the case. I'm just a lot less. I guess you could say like a more brutish city in its layout and its appearance. Not in the attitudes of the people, but they've done a lot of work since to greenify it.
Right. I was reading a book on Seoul written in '84, and it was kind of a photo book, and the city looked pretty homely then. There was no way around it.
Yeah. I mean, it's still, I wouldn't classify Seoul as like a particularly beautiful city, but it has beautiful parts. Right. And I think the city and the national government has made a really big effort in the past like 5-10 years especially, to make it to make it a more livable city, and they've come a long way with that.
The signs are often in English as well as Korean, as you say, and even in the subway you get English announcements typically as well as Korean, but also some places Chinese, some places Japanese. What have you noticed about where you get which languages?
The Chinese and Japanese ones, they typically add just the more the spots that are more often visited by tourists, like Myeongdong, Gangnam.
Shopping centers and schools too sometimes, right?
Yeah, occasionally. Like if you have like a major university, they'll sometimes announce it then. But basically, in any place where like tourists are bound to go, they'll add those.
Do you notice anything else about sort of the way things are presented to you when you're on the subway? What changes in the experience of the trains, the riding itself as you go? Because of course, you'd assume everything's identical, but we know now that the languages that are the announcements come in change a little bit. What else varies when you're just riding around? Does anything besides that vary?
Yeah, the ridership varies a lot depending on what line you're on and what part of the city. If you're on the one line, the population is much older.
Yes.
It's probably going to be at least like half, like senior citizens. Because the one
in the early morning, making use of their free rides.
Yeah, and the one passes through like all the kind of like the older, more traditional parts of the city, Dongdaemun, Jongno.
And the line 2, which the Koreans call the Jiokchol, the Hell Subway.
Yeah.
Does that live up to its name, the line 2?
No, I mean line 2 is fine. It's just it's just that rush hour. It's particularly packed. But fortunately, because of my schedule, I very rarely have to take it at rush hour.
You can avoid the Jiokchol.
Yeah. But when people call it the Jiokchol, I'm just like, well, okay, go ride the subway in New York or Los Angeles for a week and then come back. And
Los Angeles gets less crowded, but yeah, New York, at least it never smells bad here, unlike the New York subway.
Yeah, and it's just it's just easier to use. It's a quicker, more efficient subway system.
Right.
The 2 is interesting because the 2 kind of goes in a circle. So you have some areas like you get to around like the Hongdae Sinchon area, and it's just a ton of students, and then you go down across the river, and you're in the Yeongdongpo neighborhood, which is a lot older, a lot more industrial. So it's a kind of like a lower class part of the city, and then you go over to the east and you're by like Gangnam and by Coex, and you had people that are very sort of like. It sounds odd to say about the subway system, but like a wealthy ridership, and so the ridership can change quite a bit. The type of advertisements you see a lot.
That's a good indicator.
Particularly the one that really sticks out is on line 3, which passes to like Apgujeong, Shinsai, like the very sort of.
I'm staying near the Apgujeong station, so that's the one I see the most. And in that station, plastic surgery everywhere.
90% of the ads are plastic surgery, and on the trains on line 3, it's probably at least like 50% is for plastic surgery.
Yeah, I mean, when I knew about the plastic surgery thing in Korea, I knew it was popular, but I didn't realize how popular it is until I got to Apgujeong, where I'm staying, so it's every day I see that. But I also noticed riding line 6, which I believe I rode here. It's 6, right? But riding it the other day, typically, most lines I ride, I'm going to be the only visible white guy around. Line 6, not necessarily. There's a few more. There's a few more guys like us. Not a lot, but a few more. Why is that?
Oh, because it cuts right through like the Itaewon like Noksapyeong Samgakji area, where that's kind of like where the biggest foreigner population is. Like Itaewon is it's the foreigner neighborhood where you have a lot of expats live, and you have the biggest gathering of like expat-owned businesses and restaurants. So
I would ask you how many different neighborhoods you've lived in here, but I should say how many different home subway stations have you had?
1, 2, 4. I've lived in 4 different places.
What were your stations in these places?
Like I said, the first one was Songjeong, my first year in Seoul, and then when I came back to the city. It was up in the northeast, Sangye. And then I moved to the Hongdae neighborhood. So Hongdae station was closest. And now I live down the road, so it's Bomun station.
And tell me, when you're traveling, given all the work you've done with Seoul Suburban, when you're in a new city, do you first take a look at the subway system? Is that the framework you use when you go somewhere else? Just see how does this compare?
It depends what city I'm in, but if they have a subway station, odds are I'm going to use it because I'm going to be, using public transportation. So, I've always sort of had like a kind of like mild interest in public transportation, just because I think, it sort of, it can give you kind of clues about the city or the culture that you're on. When I'm in like a different country, it's you do kind of, especially after riding the subway so much in Seoul, you do kind of like notice a few different nuances or sometimes similarities here and there.
What have been some of the most interesting transit systems you've been on that have told you the most about a city or a culture when you're traveling, when you're outside of Seoul?
The Pyongyang metro.
Oh, you've been on that thing? Wow! Do you get to go to more than 2 stations?
No, they put you on, and you're in a car all by yourself. You and the other foreigners in your group. And
do you suspect that they're just running it when someone's went into a group?
No, I don't think that's the case. Like from when I was there, it seemed like it was active, and from everything like I've heard and read about it, it is a functioning subway system.
What's it like?
Very deep to protect against bombs from the American imperialists.
I imagine it stairs, not an escalator. Am I right about that?
The station we were at had an escalator. I don't know. I can't speak for all of them. And it was turned on. They might have turned it off as soon as we were gone.
They don't have the thing where, like in Seoul, it stops until someone steps on it, right? It's either going or not.
We were only there for like 5 minutes.
This is all speculation on my part.
It's speculation. But they're very deep. They're a little bit like you've seen pictures from like the Moscow. So they have the ones we had like the big giant murals of Kim Il Sung doing his thing. The stations we were in were very well taken care of. The trains were really old, but
I've heard they came from like Berlin, like their old Berlin trains.
They're great. I mean, they look like trains from the 1940s. They had like polished wood. Again, the one we were on, I can't speak for all of them, but
the likes of what you had never seen before, though, I would imagine.
Yeah, only in movies. So that was, I mean, yeah, by far the most interesting.
And yet the shortest distance you've ridden on any subway system,
Yeah.
but the deepest you've gone as well. So that's something too. But what about among the more normal, like the non-North Korean countries? What kind of a system? Which systems tell you a lot, or what system is just? What system do you remember? Because I mean, sometimes you just forget what a train was like when you go to another city. It's just like any other. But where stands out?
Yeah. In university, I lived in Rome for a bit, and Rome's like a really big city, but they have a really meager subway system. They've got 2 lines, and they'd like to make more, but the problem is that every time you start digging in that city, you run into like an archaeological site of profound significance. So
have you ridden the one in Mexico City at all?
No.
They've got the Aztec ruins, like that. They just when digging the subway, they find ruins. They put them in the stations.
Oh.
Like they just put like they make stations museums of Aztec stuff.
Yeah.
But in Rome, they don't want to do that.
Well, yeah. They don't want to disturb too much. So I mean, that's that obviously that has kind of a big connection with the city and the country that it's located in, and just not so much in what is there, but what isn't there. Another one that was on not too long ago was like the Singapore subway station,
Which I imagine is very clean.
which is very clean. It's it's pretty close to Seoul's and its level of quality. It's incredibly powerfully air conditioned. Which is
Too powerfully.
yeah, it's like too powerful, which is something that Singapore does. Like if you go to shopping malls in Singapore, offices, they blast the air conditioning. So I think I've got friends who live in Singapore, and they sometimes wear sweaters at work. Yeah, it's in that sense, it kind of reflects. I guess the Singapore culture at large. It's very orderly. It's very clean. It's very well taken care of. Very heavily air conditioned.
It's good to get validation on these ideas because I wrote something for The Guardian a while ago on the notion that you can understand a city's culture by paying close attention to its transit system. So from somebody who actually writes about it regularly, I'm glad to hear that. But tell me, whether or not in the subway system of Seoul, what kinds of things still surprise you about this city after years here? What sorts of things do you still catch your eye? Like, that's how things are here.
Yeah. I think we get a lot of surprises through the course of the project. We're still often being surprised by things that we find. Just by going to a new neighborhood and exploring a bit.
There's always something that surprises you, then, every time.
Yeah, just about. It's very rare that we go to a station and we're like, okay, yeah, I get it.
Another one of these.
Yeah, another one of these. And the fact that is so rare itself, I think, is still kind of surprising. We'll go to areas where we're not expecting anything to find, they'll have, one example is, we went to this neighborhood, kind of like in south of the river, like sort of on the far west side, which is relatively kind of newly developed and just kind of a lot of apartment buildings and things like that. But it also happened to have like the only remaining Hyangyo, the only remaining Confucian school in the city, and so something that was like during the Joseon time was sort of like the equivalent of like a high school where the aristocrats went to study and to learn how to be like good Confucians and
How to be the ruling class.
yeah, and I had no idea that existed anymore in the city, and here it is in this very sort of nondescript, out of the way neighborhood, which and I'd never heard of it before. It's not in any of the guidebooks, but it's
It's a known attraction.
yeah, but it's kind of it has this it's a kind of a historically significant place.
How many would you estimate? How many subway stations have you explored, and their surroundings have you explored out of the sort of 500-ish there are?
We've been to about 140 something now. A lot of those like 500 stations are actually like technically outside the city limits.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Not actually Seoul.
no, because I mean the subway system like expands. You know, it extends to Incheon. It goes. You know, the system itself like goes to like 3 different provinces. Like it connects places in Gyeonggi province. You can take it into like eastern Gangwon province. It goes down to like Cheonan and Chungcheong province. So
It's hardly just a city subway system.
yeah, it's not. It's it's a regional. It's a multi-province system, and so a lot of the stations are like actually outside the city limits. And again, for the purpose of our sanity, we don't go beyond the city limits in the project. But even just within the city, I think there's 300 some.
So you could, by some measure, you're almost halfway through the stations. But do you anticipate any more lines being built within the city? Do you hear about the possibility of more stations coming? What's coming?
They're doing that as we speak. Like the Line 9, which is like the newest one, they're expanding further east. Nearby here, there's talk of, from Bomun Station where I live, there's plans to connect through there, like not a subway, but like a light rail north through some neighborhoods that aren't particularly close to a station. You know, they've a couple of years ago you had the addition of the airport railroad, which connects Seoul Station to Incheon Airport. So they're continually adding new lines, new stations.
Do you think about wanting Seoul Suburban to be among the first to use those stations, to somehow get there early? I wonder what a station opening day is even like here. I imagine that's kind of an event.
Yeah, I imagine that they have people in, guys in business suits wearing sashes, because that's what they
definitely
do.
sashes.
And they definitely, I'm sure they have I don't know what you even call them, but like the giant flower bouquets on, I don't know how to describe them, but whenever a business opens, you have this giant kind of flower bouquet on this stand.
Yes, I think I've seen those things. Yeah, they'll have one of those things as well. They'll have all of the standard Korean opening ceremony ribbon cutting trappings. Now, tell me, when you're exploring Seoul, not in search of transit stuff, not in search of what's around a subway station, what are you looking for? What are your main interests in the city other than transit?
Oh, usually food.
Yes. Not surprising in Korea, considering the quality of the food. What do you like to eat here?
Everything. Whenever I leave Korea, the food is probably the thing that I miss the most.
Korean food?
Yeah. The food here is great. The restaurant scene is great. The per capita number of restaurants is going to be off the charts. And
coffee shops, which I especially enjoy.
Yeah, coffee shops have just exploded. That's another big change. Like when I first came here, if I wanted to go to a cafe, I had to get on the subway or get on the bus from where I lived.
Unbelievable, considering now.
Now you have about as many cafes as you have convenience stores, and I have no idea how they stay in business, but they do.
They seem to have just integrated into the Seoul's economic ecosystem just fine. Like they all kind of run.
Yeah, but the restaurant scene here is good, and typically it's not very expensive. And in the past few years, in particular, the non-Korean restaurant scene has really improved. Really improved. It used to be that beyond like very mediocre Italian food and like Japanese, there weren't too many options. But now, as the foreign population has increased, particularly now, you have some like very good Italian restaurants. You get really good French restaurants. There's just down the street from here, there's a really good Uzbeki place.
I couldn't even find one of those in Los Angeles. I thought there's got to be one.
There's two. Well, now in Bai Dongdaemun, there's a little like Russian Central Asian village. So, like if you want to stock up on Russian vodka, you can go there. So Yeah, I mean, the bulk of my kind of exploring is done through the project, through our blog, because typically we try to get to like one station every week, and so
When you get there, you gotta eat.
so I mean, most of like kind of exploration of Seoul is done through that, and when I'm not doing that, it's more often it's just not doing that much exploration, but just kind of going to places that know and want to go to.
Which stations have the best food inside them? I'm always on the lookout for where there's good or acceptable or not too junky food in a station. Where do I have to go for that?
Oh, good question. You'd have to go to like one of the major stations to get kind of like a decent meal.
You might as well go outside at that point. Now, what did it feel like to see the fruits of your labors on Seoul Suburban made into a Korean language book?
Very rewarding, very weird. It's the process from when we were asked to put the book together through publication. We went through kind of a lot of emotions, a lot of perspectives of looking at it. When we were initially asked to do the book, I think the initial proposal and sort of the assumption was that it was going to be in English, and then our publisher decided that no, we want to do it. We want to do it in Korean for the local market. We want to translate it. So. The idea of turning the blog into a book was an idea that Liz and I had toyed with, and something that we kind of discussed that we wanted to do eventually. And so when the proposal was there, we were really excited. When they said, "Oh, we want to do it in Korean," I was a little perplexed.
Do I have to do it?
No, I couldn't do it. My Korean's not that good. I could write like an elementary school level.
No foreigner is good enough to really write. It seems like I've met some fluent people, but writing is it's like in English. No matter how good you are, unless you're a native speaker, you're probably going to sound a little weird writing.
Yeah. I mean, even people who are like very good speakers of second languages, it's quite rare that they do that.
But they're translators. That's the plus. They work not too expensively.
And I don't have to pay for it. The publisher does. So when we said, like, when we were told, oh, it's going to be in Korean, as a writer, you feel very sort of attached to the language that you write in. So there was kind of a bit of a sense of disappointment that it wasn't going to be in English because obviously, if when you write something in English, to use kind of like a familiar metaphor, like that's like your child. Right. Whereas if it's translated, it's like they're like your nephew or your niece.
Yeah.
And
some kid out there. Yeah.
You love them, but it's not the same. Yeah, you don't feel the same level of attachment. You're not going to put them in the will. But it's been, at the same time, sort of after I got over the initial disappointment, you come to the realization that, well, one, not many people who write have the opportunity to have their work translated into a different language. It's quite unusual.
Least of all Korean.
Least of all Korean, yeah. And also just the fact that even if the opinion didn't extend beyond our editor and the staff at the publisher, there was the realization that there were some people who thought that what we were doing was, worthwhile enough that
they liked it.
Locals would want to see what we're doing and want to hear our opinions about stuff and
about their own city.
Yeah, and that's that's really kind of a very big privilege, and it's a little bit. It's really gratifying to know that there are people out there who think that what you have to say is something that
they didn't know
that they didn't know that they should hear. So, and then too, it's been it's once the book finally came out, it's a little odd because this is the first book I've done, and to have it finally from the back of the printer and in your hand is great, but when you look at it and you're like you don't recognize it 100%, and and my Korean isn't good enough where I can I could plod through it with a dictionary.
You can't read at a glance,
right? So you kind of feel like a honky-tonk musician whose first album has been a techno remix yes. of your song. So there's it's yours, and you're really proud of it, and I actually wrote a book, but I don't know what it says.
Yeah, and if you send it to your mom, it's oh, here's my book. Yeah. You take a look. You can really operative word look.
Yeah. So it's weird. I mean, fortunately, we do have an English book that will be coming out. Unfortunately, the Korean version does look really good, and Liz's photos are fantastic, and and it's gotten a good reception so far, and it's just been an interesting experience to see how people react to that, because it is kind of, from the Korean's perspective, it's also something unusual. It's kind of a curiosity that there's this foreigner who's writing about this city, and it's been put into Korean. So,
do you have the sense that you won't rest until you've got all 300 stations and whatever ones they add in the meantime explored?
No, to be honest, no. Because we've been working on this project. First me and Liz, and now a couple of different photographers since Liz moved back to the States. We've been doing it for close to 5 years now, and we're halfway done. So
foresee a decade-long project?
Probably not. I think as long as I'm here, I'll continue doing it, just because I like to get out and explore the city. Whether we have a readership or not.
It's convenient to have a scheme to do it.
Yeah.
Whether or not it doesn't matter who's reading.
Yeah, and that was kind of the main impetus, was just to have this motivation to get out and explore, because I wanted to do that when I came back, but I figured I needed some kind of project to make sure I stuck with it. So it's still something that I really enjoy, and that I think we'll probably be doing for as long as I'm here. I don't know how long I'll be here. I don't have things planned out long term, but hopefully, if at some point I leave Seoul or I just stop, someone else will kind of carry on.
Pass the torch.
Yeah. Because it's, the project has, it's developed really well. It's gotten bigger and more successful than I think we ever anticipated it being. So, I think it's something that, with or without me, hopefully will be continued.
I've been speaking here not far at all from the Anam station with Charlie Usher. He is the author of Seoul Suburban, a blog exploring Seoul through its subway stations. And he's also got the book out, Chari wa Rije Jihachol Yohengi. There, got it pretty much right. Pronunciation needs work. But, Charlie, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to all the backers of Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea tour on Kickstarter. Adam Hartzell, Aidan Nullman, Alfred Lee, Andy Cooney, Angus Gordon, Bala Chinupati, Cam Smith, Chin Music Press, Dan Caraselli, Danny, Deborah Smith, Emmett Farragher, Umberto Grant, Ian Plosker, Ismail Kennedy, Jackie Gast, Jay Chang, Jeffrey Davis, James DeVito, Jonathan Filbert, Josh Paget, Kimberly Hahn, Manvir, Mark Hines, Matthew Workman, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Monica Eck, Michael Fransky, MJ Pritchett, Patrick O'Flaherty, Patrick Park, Piers Rippey, Robert Salzberg, Samuel Hansen, Sean Brown, Themistocles Eucrucis, Thomas Unterberger, Timothy Dobbs, and Wayne Wright.